going to die. Might not be tonight, it might be, but it might not be tonight. It may be sometime many years from now, may be relatively soon, but you will die. And so that's going to bring up a question. It's probably the third biggest question in life. The first biggest question is probably, how did we get here? That's usually a pretty big one in the broad sense. How did we as people get here? The second question is, why are we here? And the third question is, where do we go when we're not here? And so where do we go after we die? That's the question for tonight. And that's the answer that we're going to try to give from Scripture. To do so, like normal, we'll take a little bit of a look at some context and, in this case, define a few key terms. And then we'll move into the process that happens when someone dies. And we'll spend the rest of our time trying to figure out some of the details that we can figure out about this. Ask some questions and try to get some answers. So again, to start with, we'll look at a little bit of context. The biggest piece of context is this, that we are not told everything about what happens once we die. The Bible reveals things on a need-to-know basis. Evidently, we do not need to know everything that will happen after this life is over. And so we're told what we do need, but it leaves us a little bit curious. And so on the one hand, we could say, well, we aren't told everything, and so we'll leave it at that. But in reality, if I never addressed anything that we aren't fully informed on, then I'd be out of a job, because there are so many things that leave us wanting just a little bit more. And so we'll try to figure out what we can, but we have to realize that there is a lot that isn't told to us. Even more strangely, perhaps, there's a lot in the Bible about heaven and about hell, but there's a whole lot less about what happens immediately after death. There's a whole lot less about what happens in another area that's usually referred to as Hades that we'll talk about tonight. And so we'll try to get around to that also. A few key terms to keep in mind, though. The first one is soul. Now, there is, in the minds of most scholars, a difference between soul and spirit, but the Bible uses them so interchangeably most of the time that we don't really need to make that division tonight. And so if we're talking about the soul or the spirit, we mean the same thing in this case. The soul of the human is the eternal spiritual part of the person. Now, when we say eternal, we don't mean that it has always existed, at least we don't think so, but instead that it will continue to exist after this life is over. And again, it is spiritual. It is the spiritual part of a person. The physical is nothing or next to nothing when it comes to what makes somebody who they are. The next term that we would want to identify is that of Hades. Hades in the New Testament is very likely the same as Sheol in the Old Testament, both being a place where departed spirits go to. And really that's about as descriptive as we need to be. It's where not really dead persons go, but instead departed spirits, since we're not talking about the bodies anymore, we're just talking about the soul that has gone on. And so Hades, though, gets a bad rap, and part of that has to do with the best known earliest, not the earliest, but the most popular early translation in English of the Bible, where the Greek word Hades, which, by the way, in Greek is pretty much spelled the same as it is in English for Hades, we took that word and we sometimes translated it that way, but sometimes we translated it in the King James Version as hell. Well, that's not accurate as far as hell, the place where it's being prepared currently for the devil and his angels. That hell is not the same as Hades that we're going to talk about tonight. Instead, Hades, again, is just the place where departed spirits go. The other terms that we want to keep in mind are heaven and hell. Simple enough, but heaven and hell are different from Hades in the general sense. Heaven and hell are the eternal resting places of souls. Depending on what deeds they've done in this life, they will either be eternally punished or eternally rewarded in kind. But it is the final, the eternal resting place, not just of souls, but of actually resurrected persons. And so we'll make that distinction now, and we'll bring that back up in a few minutes as well. Okay, so what happens when someone dies? Well, first, they have to die. And so you have to go from the state of being living to the state of being dead. That can happen in different ways. That can be a loss of brain function. That can be the heart stopping of its pumping of blood to the body. And so it can happen different ways, but once you're dead, you are dead. What we mean by that is that the human body that we are inhabiting has ceased functioning. It stopped working. That's all that death really means, at least if you believe that there is more to life than just this body. And so as soon as that happens, as we can understand, as soon as that happens, the spiritual is removed from the physical. And so we take a passage like James chapter 2 and verse 26, and we say, okay, well, the body without the spirit is dead. So whenever death comes to the body, then the spirit is no longer part of that body. And so the body is left here to decay back into what it was to begin with. Or dust to dust is the phrase that gets used from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 20. It's a little more than dust, but when you really boil it down, it's not much different. It's a little bit of carbon, it's a lot of water, it's some calcium, it's chemical compounds that make up other things in this world as well. And so our bodies aren't particularly special in that way. They'll just return to the dust from which they came, meaning that God created them from that dust in the beginning of time. So what we have so far is the body has stopped working, it has died, and now the spirit and the body are separate. So the question is not what happens to the body. We don't really care that much about what happens to it. Instead, we care about what happens to the spirit. There's something we need to clarify when we get to this point, though. After the spirit leaves the body, there is, as best as we can tell, and there is some disagreement here, there is a judgment. And I say a judgment intentionally. And so we see this in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26. It's appointed for man to die once, and then comes the judgment. It doesn't seem to be talking about a far-off judgment, but instead a judgment that happens, a sorting that happens immediately. And the souls then would be sorted into one of two places, which we'll talk more about as we get into Hades. But the souls have been separated from the body, and now they've been sorted according to the deeds that they've done. From that period on, they will be waiting for the second judgment, for the final judgment. And really, probably a better way of understanding this may be to put it in terms of what we think of today, in that it depends on the kind of trial that you're taking part in. But a judge can pronounce a judgment that happens, but it may be a little bit later before a sentencing hearing actually takes place. And so what we're saying is, essentially, after we die, there is a judgment that takes place. You're decided on as guilty or innocent, and then you're going to be put in a holding cell for a time. Essentially, this could be jail in our analogy here. It's just that jail isn't necessarily a bad thing for everybody involved, at least for those who will be saved. And then you wait in jail until the final sentencing hearing, when you will either face 30 hours of community service or 9 consecutive life sentences, whatever it may be that you've done and whatever the reward or punishment should be for that. And so all we're saying is that once we die and the soul departs from the body, it has to go somewhere. And so God has made a plan for that. And God's plan for that takes place, or the place for this is in Hades. Again, not that Hades is a great place or an awful place, it's just a place. And it is divided into these two areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go on. The next thing that will take place after the sorting or judgment into these two areas is the resurrection, as far as the timeline goes. Now, the resurrection will take place at the end of time. It will take place along with the final judgment. It'll take place immediately preceding the final judgment. And so this resurrection that takes place will, in a way, reunite soul and body. Now, not the physical body that we had before, but according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it will be united now with an incorruptible body, one that will not perish, one that will not grow old. And so this body will be attached to this spirit. Now, how that works is a different lesson, and it's above my pay grade as well. So we won't address that tonight, but what we're saying is that the resurrection will take place when Christ returns, when time ends, when the elements will be melted with fervent heat. All things will vanish away, but we will be reunited with a spiritual body, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, around verse 52 and following. After that, as we said, the final thing that will take place is the final judgment. And so there will be this new body that's been reunited with the Spirit, and they will be finally sentenced either to heaven or to hell. That's pretty straightforward. I don't think I'm revealing anything to you that you didn't necessarily know before, but that does come with some complications. And so we're going to try to address some of those complications, even though it's lined out pretty simply. You die, your soul splits from your body. That soul is sorted into one of two places within Hades, either into paradise or to torment. And then the resurrection comes, and then the final judgment. But what does this really look like? And so if we try to ask this question, where do we go when we die? Well, the only real description that the Bible gives of this comes in Luke chapter 16. And so that's why that text was read for us. And in Luke chapter 16, it describes what Hades looks like here. And so in verses 22 and 23, it says, "So it was that the beggar died," as we said, that was the first step. "His soul was carried by the angels." That should be our understanding. Not that his body was physically carried off, but rather his soul. "And it was carried to Abraham's bosom," which elsewhere is referred to as paradise, so it can also be known by that name. "And the rich man also died," took that first step. "He was buried, and being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom." So when it says that he's in torments in Hades, it's really talking about two places, right? It's saying he's in torments within Hades. So Hades is this larger waiting room, and then you separately have each side of this. And importantly, in verse 26, it says, "Besides all this, between us and you, there's a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here cannot, nor can those from there pass to us." And so it is completely separate, and there's not any chance of you going from one side to the other. I was thinking about this earlier and thinking that it's been maybe 2 months now. I went to the doctor here in town. This is at the Garrett Clinic. And when I went in, I was going for a different reason, but I also happened to have a cold or maybe a sinus infection. And so as soon as I go in, this is after the pandemic, they say, "Okay, great. Is that a cough that you have?" I said, "Well, yes." And so they sent me to the other side of the building. I don't know if you've ever been in there, but if you go in, there's a door to the right and a door to the left. I'd never even been in the left side, but that's where they sent me. They sent me to a waiting room that was separate from anyone else who was not sick. I guess it's precautionary, but the point is that it was two separate waiting areas. I was waiting, and people were waiting over here. That's the only difference. But I really couldn't come back over to where they were waiting, and they really weren't supposed to come over to where I was waiting. When it was my time to be seen, I was called back, but I was only called back to that side of the building. And it's kind of the older side of the building as well. But I didn't have the option to go back to one of the rooms where everybody else was being seen, because we were separated as soon as I walked in, essentially. And that's what we're saying about the soul here, that the souls, after they depart, they're sorted into either paradise or into torment. And from there, they stay in that path until it's their time for the final judgment, where they'll eventually meet their eternal fate. But here's kind of the question that comes up with this. Is there really any difference between Hades and heaven and hell? Is there really any tangible difference that I can say, well, this is what makes it paradise versus this is what makes it heaven, this is what makes it torment versus this is what makes it hell? And I think the simplest explanation, and probably the reason that this exists in the first place, is because the difference that we see scripturally, once we die, our soul is detached from anything. It's just a soul. During the time that it's just a soul, before the final judgment, it needs somewhere to be. And so what God has done is he said, well, in that state, I will put people here. Once I judge them, and more importantly, once their body is resurrected with them, then they can enter into their final destination. And so what it seems like is that the main difference between, let's say, paradise and heaven is the state of the soul. Is the soul by itself, or is the soul with its resurrected body? And when it is with its resurrected body, it now gets to go into heaven. Before that point, it stays in paradise. And so is there a difference? Well, at least in those terms, there's a difference. Is it a huge difference? Maybe not so much, but we'll have some other questions to try to answer this as well. The next question, kind of similar to this, in fact, it's half of what we already asked, is paradise the same as heaven itself? And I think this is the one that we're more concerned with. I don't think many people are all that worried about if torment is the same as hell. They understand that it's bad either way. But to the same effect, we really ought to be able to say that it doesn't matter too much about paradise or heaven because they're awfully similar in that they are both good as well. But again, the question is, are paradise and heaven the same or are they not? Well, there are differing views on this. Some people say yes, that heaven is paradise, that paradise is heaven, and that there's really no difference, and there is no real Hadean realm. It's just kind of all the same, but it gets described differently. That might be possible, except that the Bible does make it awfully clear that there is something different about them, and that there is a distinction, and there seems to be a waiting period in this place that won't be, that comes before going to the other place. So that's what some suggest, that they are the same. Some suggest that maybe it's just a portion of that place. So some people will say maybe paradise is in heaven, but it's not heaven itself. Maybe it's outside the city gates, something like that. And I guess that's possible. It's mostly just speculation, but I suppose it's possible. Another suggestion I think does make some sense is that we are thinking of this in too physical of terms. That's certainly possible because we are physically minded. So is it possible, and this is the suggestion, is it possible that this is not really a difference in two locations, but a difference in a state of being? And so what we're saying is that the only difference between paradise and heaven really is that paradise is the reward that you experience as a soul independent of a body, and heaven is the reward that you experience once your soul has been reunited with a somewhat more physical body, even though it's not physical at all. So that makes sense. It's kind of like saying that someone has a driver's permit versus a driver's license. Either way, you still get the reward of driving the vehicle, but once you get the license, you have a little bit more freedom, you have a little bit more benefit that comes along with that. And so that's what we're saying about this option here, that maybe the real difference is just that the soul now is reunited with a body, and therefore it gets to do a little bit of extra things that it couldn't do before, and that's called heaven rather than it being called paradise. It's possible that it's just a difference in name. So that's probably the best we can do to give an answer to that, as far as if heaven and paradise are exactly the same. But this is maybe the more important question. Is Christ in paradise? Or is God in paradise? Of course, the answer to that is kind of the same either way. But are they in paradise? And whenever we die, will we immediately be united with God and with Christ for the first time? Or do we have to wait for a period of time before that? Well, let me start with this. Can a Christian call somewhere paradise if God is not there? What would it mean to be in paradise and not have God present? Is there any reward to that? Is it just a nice place where there's a tropical beach that you get to walk along? That's kind of the idea a lot of people have. And there's nice island music playing all the time. It's not a reward if God is not there. Now, that being said, we see in the Bible, I'll give one example here, but we see different places where there's an understanding that the soul will be united with God immediately after death. For example, Paul says this, you remember his sort of internal struggle that he's having in Philippians chapter 1, whether it's better to stay to help the Philippians or whether it's better for him to go on from this life. He says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 23, having a desire to depart, that is from this life, and be with Christ, which is far better. Okay? Paul says that he understands that when he departs from this life, it will be to be with Christ. And again, what kind of paradise is it that doesn't have Christ in it already? Another question worth asking and worth answering. Why is it that the Bible says so much about heaven and hell and says so little about this place of Hades? Why doesn't it mention very much about Hades, about torment, about paradise? Why is it that this passage in Luke chapter 16 is really the only vivid explanation that we get of what this place looks like? Well, there's probably a few reasons we can give for that. The first reason is this, which is kind of what we've been saying. It's because they're not all that different. They are different in the ways that we've talked about, but paradise and heaven, they're pretty similar. They are a place of reward for those who have followed God and who have lived a life faithfully to Him. God will be there. Christ will be there. They're a place of eternal life. They're a place of all the things that we expect. The difference may be mostly in the state of the soul where we, or after this life, whether we're just the soul or whether we've been resurrected. So it's kind of like making a difference on the negative side of saying, well, is it really all that different to talk about jail than to talk about prison? They are different, certainly, but there's a lot of similarities to them. So is it worth spending a whole lot of time talking about jail when you could just talk about prison? Or to make it more positive, would it make a lot of sense to spend time talking about Disney World as a whole or the Magic Kingdom as an individual part of it? And so it's this idea that they're similar enough that you probably don't have to focus too much on the one over the other. But a second point worth making with this is that Hades is temporary. In fact, it will be done away with entirely. In Revelation chapter 20 and verse 14, we are told that Hades will be cast into the lake which burns with fire. Okay, why? What purpose is there to a place where God sends souls that have departed from their body waiting for a coming resurrection? At the end of time, will that still be necessary? Is there some farther resurrection that will take place in the future? There's nothing. And so there's no need for this waiting area anymore if everyone's already in the place that they're going to go. Now, there's kind of another question that we won't really answer here. There's a question of timeline. Imagine this. Imagine someone died around the time of Christ. Well, let's just take the thief on the cross as an example. If he dies the same day as Jesus, and he's told that he will enter paradise, well, it's been 2,000 years since then. And what if Christ doesn't come back for another 2,000 years? Does that mean that the thief there, that he would be in paradise for 4,000 years as we see it? Sort of. But that's thinking in awfully literal and temporal terms that probably don't apply in the first place. The second point to make there is, even if you spent 4,000 years waiting on eternity, once you get into eternity, how long is 4,000 years? It's a blink of an eye. And so it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. But we will be in paradise for a period of time, but compared with the state that we'll be in heaven, it won't seem that any time has passed, more than likely. The third thing, though, as far as why is it that the Bible mentions heaven and hell rather than paradise and torment so often, is because God has prepared those places for the eternal destination of these souls. He made a holding place for the temporary state of these souls, but that's not his eternal design. So why would he bother spending all of his time telling us about the temporary when he could tell us about what will be permanent? And so God has designed hell. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 41, he's designed hell as a place for the devil and his angels to be held for all time. He also, according to his Son in John chapter 14, verse 2, is gone to prepare a place for us. Well, that's not paradise that Jesus has gone to prepare a place. That's not the place where there are many mansions. That place is the heaven that we expect to visit. And so Hades is not God's ultimate plan. So why does he spend more time talking about heaven and hell? That is the end of his plan. That's the end goal. And so he focuses in more on that. One final question that we'll make here. Is it wrong, with the understanding that we've gone through tonight, is it wrong for someone to say that their loved one is in heaven? First off, going back to what we talked about this morning, maybe if it's obvious that their life did not reflect anything of Christ, then they would just be inaccurate in their statement. But more than that, what we've talked about tonight, if the soul, as soon as it departs from the body, ends up in this place of Hades, if it ends up in paradise, not technically in heaven, is it wrong for us to say that our loved one who's passed away is now in heaven? Well, that's a good question. It's a question worth asking, but let's go back to what we already mentioned before. If God is in paradise, if Christ is in paradise, what difference does it make if I say that the soul of the departed loved one is in heaven, or if I say it's in this separate place where God also is? If their soul is with God, if their soul is with Christ, I'll call anywhere that is heaven. Right? I think we can be okay giving a little bit of grace there to say, yeah, if their soul's gone on to be with the Lord, they're in heaven already. No matter what the Bible says as far as the particulars of what order things will take place in. The other side of that, of course, is don't discourage someone who's already grieving. You don't need to take that opportunity to say, oh, well, they're not really in heaven yet. That's going to go over really well at the funeral, and probably not the time to bring up the more minor details of the theological explanation of what happens after this life. That's the end of my questions. That's the end of our lesson for tonight. And it's not any stretch to make this into an invitation anyway. The invitation is still the same as kind of what we started with. You will die. There is one of two places that you will go. Sure, in the meantime, there's a temporary place before you get to your eternal destination, but that will seem like the blink of an eye anyway, and it will still be just as rewarding, just as punishing as it needs to be as God has ordained it. So tonight, you have a decision to make, and it's a decision that affects your eternal destination. If you want to make a decision that leads toward heaven, this is your opportunity. If you want to make a decision that leads toward hell, unfortunately, this is also your opportunity. But we pray that you make a decision for the former. This evening, is your best chance. This evening is your best opportunity to respond to God's invitation. And if you need to, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.